Welcome, and this is the 28th Academia Bessarion, named after the Greek cardinal who was present during the Council of Florence, who has had this beautiful villa in Rome that I discovered when I was 21 years old and fell in love with. And I'm going to go to the next slide, if it'll always resist. And I'm calling tonight's discussion Golden Ring or Laurel Garland, because I'd earlier written a book about all of the women in the Risorgimento, including the servants like Lily Wilson, without which Elizabeth would never have managed to get to Florence and so forth. And so it's going to be on the Elizabeth Barrett Browning and her circle. Nick Peters is just joining us from Belgium, and he's our pre-Raphaelite expert. And so we are recording this, and now we go to the next slide, where there's going to be a bit of a discussion. Let's see, right. And I'm going to turn off this screen here. Catherine Adoyo, she's a brilliant Dante scholar from Kenya, quotes Chinua Achebe about lions writing their history as being the opposite of when the hunters do so. Christianity is the religion of women and slaves. Its essence is of the inclusion of the other. Antonia Brocci, I hope she will join us tonight, reminds me of Rumi's "There is no other." This is about the opposite. The history of the hunters is of masculine primogeniture, Plato's myth of the metals, or pseudo-Dionysus ecclesiastical hierarchy, justifying slavery, tyranny. Alexandra Johnson, now years ago, asked me to give a lecture at Wellesley College, which I did, titling it "In Our Own Right," remembering Frederick Douglass and before him St. Teresa of Avila, noting they, being forbidden to write in civil disobedience to injustice, did so. I began my scholarly career before women's liberation and internalized that chauvinism, despising women writers such as Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Julian of Norwich, then converted. I now edit both men's and women's texts. This Bessarion discussion will be on a project on Elizabeth Barrett, Moulton Barrett, and her circle that I'm proposing to the Obama Foundation, where I show that the Victorian Anglo-Florentines, in solidarity with liberation causes, created what Karl Popper termed as the Open Society, suggesting it as a model for our own. I think they were more advanced than we are today. And we've now got another participant joining us. O Bella Libertà. This is the title that we have given to our Italian translation of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry. And on Casa Guidi, and I went there on my bicycle this morning just after Mass when it was still not quite daylight, is this plaque. Here wrote and died Elizabeth Barrett Browning, not exactly spelled correctly, and who in the heart of a woman reconciled science, learned science, and the spirit of poetry, and made of her verse a golden ring, aureo anello, between Italy and England. And Florence, in her gratitude, places this stone in 1861, the year of her death. They also, in that year, offered to Robert to raise the child, Penn Browning, at the state's expense, because Italy had just become the new nation and Florence was the capital. But Robert refused and cut off both the hair of the corpse of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, her spaniel curls, and those of Penn, and took him back to England to become a proper English gentleman, against which Penn rebelled. And then these are the books that I've been working on in this connection, and this is the reason why I'm now here in Florence. I edited with my father Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry for Penguin, And I said in the contract, the cover is not negotiable. It has to be Michelangelo's Aurora, because I was getting very tired of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry always being published with sappy sickroom images of her instead of what she really was a strong voice, a Sibylline voice. And then this is where we worked together on getting Aurora Lee translated into Italian. And then we did Casa Guidi Windows, where I used William Morris's beautiful designs. And I published this myself in our library, Arianello Association. And then we also worked with the Trollope Society, publishing Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw, that Frances Trollope wrote. It's the first anti-slavery novel. Both Frances Trollope and Elizabeth Barrett Browning are buried here in our English cemetery. And I've now admitted somebody else. I think we've got about 10 people. We have now published O Bella Libertà, but I really did have a tussle with Le Lettere, the Italian publishers, because the editor was rather prudish. And I was saying we need the bandiera, the Italian flag of red, white, and green across this. And she said, oh no, and she's done it all in sort of pale violet colors. So in a way, she's returned to making Elizabeth rather feminine and not a strong voice, which I would have preferred. And I've decided to structure this, and I'm sort of proposing it possibly as a series of podcasts. The Golden Ring or Laurel Garland, to think of the beginning of the Romantics, the precursors were Mary Wollstonecraft, Madame de Staël, Byron, Percy and Mary Shelley, John Keats and Walter Savage Landor. And he's the only one who's going to outlive the others, and he will be buried he's still living when Elizabeth Barrett Browning dies, and he's buried here a few years later. And I went back to look at the film, the earlier film made of Rudolph Bessier's The Barretts of Wimpole Street. And it's a lovely film. It's beautifully done. The year before I was born, in about 1936. And to think in that terms of how Lily Wilson, the maid, was enabling Elizabeth to survive and also to elope at 40 and to go to the continent because she had been told she would not survive with her TB in the London fogs. And then we'll discuss Aurora Lee, her epic poem in 9 books, and its connections with Margaret Fuller, the American transcendentalist journalist present at the Roman Republic. And then we'll also discuss her anti-slavery poems, as well as the novels by Fanny Trollope, Richard Hildreth, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. And then I would love to have done one on Virginia Woolf's Flush, because it is an enchanting account of Elizabeth's biography through the eyes of the spaniel. And she and Pen and Flush all had these spaniel locks and looked alike. And then on the Hawthorns, Scarlet Letter, the Blithedale Romance, and both of those are connected with Margaret Fuller's drowning in the ship called the Elizabeth, which releases Elizabeth Barrett Browning to write her epic poem. Through that, she overcomes her guilt over the death by drowning of her brother Edward, who was the heir to the slave estates. And then the Marble Faun, which Nathaniel Hawthorne writes about Robert Browning as Donatello, and the women artists and so forth are the people of this circle. And then I wanted to go and discuss the Black American, African Americans who came to Italy, Edmonia Lewis, Sarah Parker Raymond, and Frederick Douglass, and then the Somali Italian writer Ijaba Shego, who puts them all into a novel. It's a splendid novel, and it's not yet translated into English. And then Isa Blagden and Robert Lytton are connected with India. He becomes India's first viceroy. He is present at Elizabeth Barrett Browning's funeral, as is also Isa, who is looking after the orphaned pen. And Frederick Lord Leighton, who first illustrates George Eliot's Romola and Elizabeth Barrett Browning's musical instrument, and then insists on doing the tomb. And it's a very beautiful tomb. And then Robert Browning writing about the husband murdering his wife in The Ring and the Book, which quite terrified Elizabeth, as he was so obsessed with reading the Renaissance documents, legal documents about the murder trial, and so forth. And then the epilogue will be on Pen Browning. So that's the outline of what we will discuss. The courtship. Elizabeth was asked to write a few more lines of poetry to fill up a volume for her publisher. And she dashed off in a few hours Lady Geraldine's Courtship. It's a lovely poem, and I've recorded it. It's got very long lines, but it's absolutely musical. And it's about a noble, aristocratic lady with estates in Sussex who is in love with a low-born poet. And he doesn't believe that she could possibly be interested in him. And she takes him out into the forests, the woods of Sussex, and she's reading to him about poetry of Tennyson and Browning. And she proposes marriage to him. Well, Robert came back from Europe, read this poem, and knew that Elizabeth came from a family that was wealthier than his own. He dashed off the first love letter to her, and that's how the courtship began. And during that courtship, she was secretly writing sonnets. She didn't show them to him because one day he had carelessly said he despised women's sonnets. So she only presented the sonnets from the Portuguese to him quite some time later, after the baby had been born and they had been married and they were up in Bagni di Lucca to escape from the heat in Florence. And he immediately saw that they were publishable and would make money, and so he did. But those are the two drawings of Tennyson and Browning that were in Hengishorn's New Spirit of the Age, which Elizabeth was helping Hengishorn edit and was writing parts of it. And she cut out these two illustrations and had them framed in her room. And when Robert would come to call, she would have them turned so that he wouldn't see. And I copied them again from a first edition I found in the Berkeley University Library, framed them and gave them to Casaguidi, and they're on the mantelpiece there as they had been originally. At any rate, next one is, let's see if we can get it to advance. It's not, oh, I've got people in the waiting room. Sorry, you. Apologies about having you wait. Okay, admit. And there's another person, I think. Okay, we've got 10 people now. And there's a message. Okay, that's from, oh, Angie, did you manage to get in all right?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'm here. I'm sitting in the car actually.
That's right. We were talking about that. Yes.
We are in Summit County. I'm taking the kids out, and I said for an hour you are on your own, and Mom has to go and attend this meeting.
Right. Okay, we've now got to the clandestine marriage, because she couldn't tell her father she was going to get married to Robert, who was, a bit of a bounder. His father was the charter founder of the University of London so that his son could get a university education. Robert only bothered to attend one day and was living off his parents and then living off Elizabeth. and so forth. But here is the wedding certificate, the marriage certificate at Marylebone Church. My birth certificate is registered in the same parish. As Guy was born right off Wimpole Street. And here you've got Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Moulton Barrett. And she of the great slave estates, both of them of full age. He never knew her real age. She was 40 and he was younger than she. And the witnesses are Elizabeth Wilson, that's Lily Wilson, the maid, and James Silverthorne. Now, Robert was terrified of death and funerals, and he refused to go to James Silverthorne's funeral. And Hawthorne will put that into the marble form, with Donatello being terrified of burials and so on. And so they come to Florence, and I'm going to talk about her writings going backwards chronologically, because I want to talk about Aurora Leigh. And it is a 9-book epic poem, 9 being the number of the Sibyl, of the women's gestation of a child in her womb. And it is longer than Homer's Odyssey. And it's a marvelous piece of writing. She had to do it secretly, as she had done the sonnets earlier. And she would stuff what she was writing into the cushion of her deck chair in Casa Guidi. And it begins, it's prompted by Margaret Fuller's drowning. Margaret Fuller had, from proper New England, had come to Italy and fallen into the romance of Italian culture. She could not have possibly married Count Orsoli, but she did become pregnant by him. They had the child Angelo, and he's Catholic, she's Protestant, so a marriage could not have been solemnized between them in Italian laws. She is helping the Princess Belgioioso, and also with the hospitals for Garibaldi during the Roman Republic. The baby is put out to nurse and almost dies, and then she and Orsoli, when the Garibaldi's army loses the battle and they have to flee, Anita, Garibaldi's wife, is pregnant, and she will die as a result on that journey, and she and the unborn baby be buried in the sand and the dogs dig them up. And Elizabeth will write about that as well. But she writes this book about 2 women. Aurora Leigh is based on Margaret Fuller. She is blonde, blue-eyed. She is born in Florence, and then orphaned, is taken back to England to be raised by an aunt. And then there's a gypsy girl, Roma, Marian Earl, and who is raped and who bears a child. And Aurora finds her in Paris and takes her back to Florence. And it's so you get the traveling between Florence, Malvern, London, Paris, Florence. It's a travel book, which also already Madame de Staël had written in Corinne ou Italy, which is a wonderful novel. And here is Casa Guidi, where we had Elizabeth writing in this deck chair because she'd had tuberculosis of the spine as a child and was always in pain. The Queen's doctor had prescribed laudanum, so she was addicted. But Lily Wilson was very careful to always limit the doses so that she would not, so that she was able to have one successful pregnancy. There were several miscarriages, after which the doctor said no sex between Robert and Elizabeth, and that didn't help the marriage. But you can see here the engravings that I then also reproduced. Robert was buying these pieces of furniture from old convents, which at this point the Grand Duke was suppressing, and the nuns and monks were being thrown out, and the treasures were sold to the laity. And he brings back this mirror, which will come back into when we discuss The Ring in the Book. This is Margaret Fuller, who is responsible in her death for instigating the creative energy and release that Elizabeth then has to dare to write an epic poem. She'd already studied Greek and Hebrew and Latin and French and Italian. And the opening of the scene is of this austere Englishman who falls in love with an Italian woman. He sees a girl he sees in this procession outside the Santissima. This is where I go to Mass every morning. And Elizabeth has wonderful descriptions of this church. She's very Protestant herself and hates the Anglican official Church of England, but Robert will see that she's buried in a Church of England ceremony. But she's intrigued by the Italian Catholic culture and describes it very well. And here's the Hospital of the Innocents, and this part is all a part of the order of the Servites, who are the monks, the friars who have the Santissima Annunziata. And this is one of the Medici nobles. And this is, she describes the mother of Aurora dies young, and in Santa Croce in the cloister there are these tombstones, and she describes the orphan child, not knowing yet to weep. And she also describes the child growing up and seeing the portrait of the mother and imagining her as like Lamia and this Madonna of the Seven Swords that is in the Santissima. Robert is portrayed in Aurora Leigh as Romney Leigh, who is cousin, and many of these slave-owning families did intermarry in this way. And you can see from the portrait of Elizabeth that she is part black, part slave. She's not English, blonde or blue-eyed. And Robert, this is a very lovely portrait of him by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. But there are other portraits where you do see him as Negro. And he's from St. Kitts, and his family were involved with slavery. And she is from Jamaica and even more deeply involved with slavery. And her laudanum money actually comes from the ship money she has from the ship called David Lyon, which was a slave ship and then was transporting convicts to Australia. And that's the only money she has access to in this Victorian way of the men controlling everything. So it's one of the last letter she writes is to sell it. This is the church where she describes Romney Leigh, who's been rejected by Aurora Leigh, then falls in love with Marion Earl, this girl who is almost dead in the hospital. And he proposes marriage to her. The marriage is to take place at St. James, this beautiful Wren Church in Piccadilly. And Marion Earl doesn't show up because Lady Waldemar has seduced her into believing that she shouldn't marry Romney, that she is too degraded. And Lady Waldemar sees that she is trafficked and taken off to France, where she's raped and becomes pregnant and for a brief while insane. And then Aurora discovers her in Paris with the baby and describes her as the baby as like a pomegranate, which is in reference also to Robert's poetry, Bells and Pomegranates, which were embroidered on the High Priest Aaron's robe, because Robert is also part Jewish. And she is thrilled by that because she knows Hebrew, but he tries to pretend he is not Jewish. And the final scene of Aurora Leigh is where Romney comes, now blind like Rochester and Jane Eyre, to Aurora at Bellosguardo, looking down upon Florence, which still had its medieval walls before they were torn down when Florence became capital in the 1860s. And the room that's described in the epic poem where Aurora is Casa Guidi, not down in the lower part of Florence, but is transposed up in Bellosguardo. And with this sculpture of Cupid and Psyche, which is from Apuleius's poem, well, not poem, but novel, The Golden Ass, and it's a story within the story. And what's interesting is that both Elizabeth and also Pushkin loved Apuleius because he's an African writer. And here is the vista that you get from the terrace and the house of Isa Blagden, which Elizabeth would visit, and so on. And where they are, they recite together. Romney and Aurora decide not to marry. And Marian Earl refuses to marry. She says she's going to have her child and be an independent woman. She doesn't need a protector. So it's very much a sense of liberation. And they recite the lines from the Apocalypse about the golden gates and the jewels and so forth, because Florence becomes a kind of New Jerusalem. But now to go back in time, before she wrote Aurora Leigh, to support the Italian Risorgimento movement, she wrote Casa Guidi Windows. And the first one is very joyous, and it begins with hearing the little child singing in the street, "Oh, bella libertà, oh, bella, oh, beautiful freedom, oh, beautiful." And then she describes the events that happen, the fighting, Anita Garibaldi dying on that journey. And she also describes Borgo Allegri, where Cimabue carries his painting of the Madonna from his studio to Santa Maria Novella. And then later, Leighton at 25 will paint this great canvas of that scene. And you can see San Miniato up here and so forth. And he uses models. It's a very academic way of doing it. But here's Charles of Anjou, here's Cimabue and the boy Giotto and Dante and so on and so forth. And I love this little girl dancing. And Queen Victoria loved the painting and bought it. And it's now in the National Gallery, it's huge and so forth. And the Pitti Palace, Elizabeth describes the great day of rejoicing, and she draws it in a letter, when the processions of all of the guilds come to the Grand Duke, so grateful to him because he's allowed them to have the civil guard. But later he will panic and will call in the Austrian army, and that's in part 2. Where she hears this is the celebration for the civil guard. And you can see here the statues on the Ponte Santa Trinita of spring and winter and so forth, the 4 seasons. And here is the love story of Anita and Garibaldi in Uruguay. And we have this wonderful doctor, Dr. Bartolomeo Odicini, who's buried here, who was Anita's doctor and the children's doctor during that time. Garibaldi refused to be paid for his work of defending the Republic and so forth. So the children were starving and one daughter died. And Odicini was trying to see that they got enough food. And here's Garibaldi with Anita. And here's the family after Anita's death. And I love the very tender expressions between these family members and the old patriarch of Garibaldi on his island. And here is Casa Guidi, and the plaque that I showed you in the beginning is there. This is the church of San Felice, and this is the balcony where they used to walk and so forth. And she then, after the horror describing the Austrian army coming down that street, she then describes the Crystal Palace exhibition. And that's when she came to London with the manuscript of Aurora Leigh to be published. And we'll come back to Crystal Palace. In the very ending of Casa Guidi Windows, her own child has been born between the two parts, and she sees Pen in the sunlight of Casa Guidi, sort of reflecting back on the little boy who wasn't her own child, singing O Bella Libertà. And we'll come back to that at the end of this talk. And then another, when she was pregnant but didn't know it yet, and it ended in a miscarriage, she was on her honeymoon in Pisa before they came to Florence. She wrote in support of the abolitionists, the runaway slave at Pilgrim's Point. It's a very powerful poem about a slave girl who is in love with another slave, but is raped by the white master. And she sees the baby, and the face is the face of the master, and she kills it. And so at the end, they're surrounding her, they're going to stone her to death. And she says, drop that stone, straight out of the scene where Jesus, with the woman caught in adultery. And it's a very powerful poem where she speaks to America, talking about the need for freedom and not to have this kind of trauma of slavery. And then later she writes, very moved by Hiram Powell's statue of the Greek slave. This is Hiram Powell. He's an American, and he'd been found by Francis Trollope in Cincinnati, and they had together done waxworks on the American frontier of Dante's Commedia. And then he came to Florence and was teaching as a professor at the Accademia dei Belle Arti. And he will teach Sophia Peabody Hawthorne that if you want to make a statue's eyes not be blind, you have to make them with a slight protuberance. They're not absolutely round balls. And this is his observation from nature. He always used his wife Elizabeth for the nude women body, but the head here is the head of a half Greek, half English woman who's the wife of Giorgio Mignati, who does the painting of Casa Guidi. Everything in this talk is really, but the Italian word is intrecciati, it's interwoven. This is Elizabeth's sonnet to the statue. They say ideal beauty cannot enter the house of anguish. On the threshold stands an alien image with the shackled hands, called the Greek slave, as if the sculptor meant her that passionless perfection which he lent her, shadowed, not darkened, where the sill expands, to so confront men's crimes in different lands with man's ideal sense, pierce to the center art's fiery finger, and break up ere long the serfdom of this world. Appeal, fair stone, from God's pure heights of beauty against man's wrong. Catch up in thy divine face, not alone east griefs but west, and strike and shame the strong by thunders of white silence overthrown. And she's talking here about Russian serfdom as well as American slavery, and also against her father, who was the slave owner. And that statue was in the very center of the Crystal Palace exhibition and seen by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Queen Victoria was rather shocked by Elizabeth's poetry and did not approve of her. And here is Fanny, who writes the first anti-slavery novel, Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw, who had traveled up the Mississippi River and had then, with Hiram Powers, done the waxworks of Dante's Commedia. And then in her old age, she comes to Florence with her son, Thomas Adolphus, Antony's brother. Let me see if I can get the cursor. That's Thomas Adolphus. This is Fanny. And this is Theodosia, Joseph Garrow's daughter, who is quarter Indian and half Jewish. And their daughter, Beatrice, who will marry into the nobility and also have, she had a beautiful singing voice. And that is the novel Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw, Francis Trollope had written. And then almost immediately afterwards, Richard Hildreth, who's American, publishes Archie, the memoirs of Archie Moore. I wonder why Megan called their child Archie. And unfortunately, this scene of the last daughter is very much what happens even today with the Roma who live with me. Their children are taken into care violently by the authorities. And then Harriet Beecher Stowe copies both those novels with Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's immediately translated into Romanian and frees the Roma slaves who were enslaved longer than were Black in America here in Europe. And these are my workers in the cemetery. And I love them because they work so well and they are so skilled. And I teach them the alphabet because no one else has. And this is a book we have written about the 4 trafficked Roma children. And Diamanta and Yonel live with me. And when Frederick Lord Leighton sculpted Elizabeth's tomb, Robert didn't change this because it's on the back and people don't see it, but there's a broken slave shackle. And here Leighton is honoring Elizabeth's work against slavery. And then I think we needed a bit of relief from the seriousness of that part of the story with the delightfulness of Virginia Woolf's and Vanessa Bell's Flush. And we recall that the Bloomsbury group, amongst them was also Lytton Strachey, who wrote Eminent Victorians, which rather scoffs at them. But this is Vanessa Bell's drawing for Elizabeth in Wimpole Street, being brought her therapy dog, Flush, by Miss Mitford, and these are the first end papers. And then these are Vanessa Bell's drawings for the last end papers at the back of Elizabeth in Florence, but she didn't actually have this vista of the landscape, the cityscape with the Duomo. Her windows only looked onto that blank wall, which was rather like Melville's story. And here you have the dog Flush enjoying going off to the market and so forth. Margaret Fuller is very much featured in Nathaniel and Sophia Peabody Hawthorne's, because his wife also was deeply involved in his writing, Scarlet Letter and the Blithedale Romance. Blithedale Romance is about Brook Farm, which is a Fourier phalanstery, which Elizabeth puts into Aurora Leigh as something that Romney is doing in Shropshire. And also the marble faun, Donatello is the faun, and Elizabeth was always seeing the image of the faun or Pan as Robert, and she will write about that at the end of her life. And here we have Florence Casaguidi, which Sophia Peabody Hawthorne describes beautifully. They go to tea there, they are welcomed, and she describes it as like a room in a novel. And Robert is sort of doing a kind of pre-Raphaelite. I mean, he is friends with the pre-Raphaelites. You have Tennyson reading Maud, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti sketching that reading in the presence of Elizabeth and Robert when they are in London. And then we also have this group of sculptors. William Wetmore Story, he's present at Elizabeth Barrett Browning's funeral in the English cemetery. Félicie de Fourveau, she sculpts 2 works for the English cemetery. She's a French refugee royalist. And then Harriet Hosmer, she's wonderful and much admired by Elizabeth. And then we also have Edmonia Lewis, who is part African-American and part American-Indian. And she sculpts this splendid figure of Cleopatra. And then you also have Sarah Perker Raymond, who arrives in Florence with a letter from Giuseppe Mazzini. She's an abolitionist and she is African-American. And she's been studying medicine at the University of London. and she comes and she gets her MD here at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital, right down the street from me here. And we also have very much in the English cemetery, this was a place people could come to where they wouldn't be accepted properly in English society. The Brownings wouldn't have been. Isa Blagden wouldn't have been. She's part East Indian, part Jewish. And she's the character of Miriam in Nathaniel Hawthorne's Marble Fawn. And she is very much in love with Robert Lytton, who becomes the first Viceroy of India. And already Joseph Garrow, he's the son of an Indian princess. This is his aunt, and she's properly English. This is his dead father, who is the Indians, East Indian Company and so forth. And Joseph Garrow is brought up in England with a proper education, becomes a Justice of the Peace, and his daughter, who also has tuberculosis, Theodora, and Elizabeth are both convalescing with the same doctor, who takes their inkwells away from them because women shouldn't be writing when they're convalescing at the seacoast in Torquay. And that's when Edward, brother, drowned. And then at the end of her life, she writes this, the musical instrument. What was he doing, the great god Pan, down in the reeds by the river, spreading ruin and scattering bands, splashing and paddling with hooves of a goat, and breaking the golden lilies afloat with a dragonfly on the river? And he takes the reed and with a machete, the same description she'd already given it in The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point, the machete cutting the sugar cane done by the slaves and so forth. And he essentially takes Elizabeth's poetry, lives off it, and kills her. And this is what Elizabeth describes in a letter to Thomas Adolphus. And then you have Frederick Leighton illustrating brilliantly the Romola. And I've just bought these wonderful volumes yesterday, filled throughout with splendid photographs of the Florence of Romola. And then we have in the garden of the Torrigiani, and we still get help from the Marchese of Torrigiani with our garden of the cemetery, because they were doing that already in the 19th century. There is this stele of the god Pan, and its face is a bit broken, so it really is distorted. And Leighton puts this onto the harp on Elizabeth Barrett Browning's tomb. And here is his engraving of the god Pan. And it's about Robert's abuse of Elizabeth, and which Leighton understands. This is Elizabeth, the year before she dies. This is the year she dies. And you can see how ill she has become. Lily Wilson has been dismissed because she had a second baby. She called her two babies Orestes and Pylades, and if she'd had a daughter, she would have called her Electra. But that tells me that Elizabeth had taught Lily Wilson, who is the servant, classical literature. That's Agamemnon, the Aeschylus's play. And at this point, we have Robert increasing the laudanum dosage. Elizabeth doesn't die of TB. There's no hemorrhaging from the lungs. Instead, she dies from the overdosing. In Ecstasy, she's describing seeing the room as, like Robert says, a Hungarian flag, but that's kind of censoring, because Elizabeth, at the time when the Grand Duke forbade the Italian flag of red, white, and green, deliberately created Casa Guidi with green walls and white and red curtains to express her patriotic feelings for Italy. And then Robert is already projecting, writing The Ring and the Book, in which he says, but art may tell a truth obliquely, where he will describe murdering the wife. And Elizabeth is terrified of this book. I got it in facsimile in this library, and it is gruesome. And The Ring and the Book is not poetry. Elizabeth's poetry is, but not Robert's. And at the same time, Cavour, who is the architect of the Italian Risorgimento in Piedmont, dies. And she dies within a few days, grieving for him. But they have both been portrayed by Michele Gordigiani, who has a studio across the street from the English cemetery. And then when she dies, Robert commissions Giorgio Mignotti, a Greek painter in Florence, whose wife was the model for the Greek slave, to portray Casa Guidi at Elizabeth's death. And here's the chair where she was stuffing the pages of Aurora Leigh into the cushions, so Robert wouldn't see her writing it. And this is the book we put together on the English cemetery. These are Leighton's drawings for the tomb, and he was very careful to put her portrait with the spaniel locks and the head to one side from the tuberculosis of the spine. But Robert had Count Cottrell oversee the Italian sculptor, and they did the exact opposite. She's a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Englishwoman, her head held back, her hair behind her ears, the exact opposite of Elizabeth, whom Count Cottrell and Robert said was ugly. I don't think she was, but there was this, sadly, this racial discrimination going on. I applaud Harry marrying Meghan. But here you see in Leighton's drawing, Robert approaching the tomb in a toga. Robert never came back, never saw the tomb. Came back to Italy, to Venice, to Asolo, but never to Florence. And the sadness also is that Elizabeth was very upset about Count Cottrell. There was a family slave at Wimpole Street from Jamaica, Mary Crepsack. Her father paid for the publication of her Battle of Marathon when she was 12. When she was 20, her poem, very erudite, brilliant poem, Essay on Mind, it was Treppy who paid for its publication, the family slave who had inherited money from the grandfather in Jamaica. And Count Cottrell, learning about Treppy's money, then got his friend to speculate with it, and it was all lost. And Treppy went mad, having lost all of her security. And Elizabeth passionately writes to her sister saying, please, can you help Treppy? And they can't, because Victorian women didn't have access to money, only the men. And Robert has forbidden her to write to her brothers about it. And then Robert organizes the burial, the cheapest possible that he could do. Hugamaga over in a corner. Leighton insists on her being reburied in a more conspicuous place. And he also insists on it being a Church of England burial, when in her last letter that's published in the collected letters, she's writing to her sister against the Church of England. So there's a kind of violation going on. But these are the three harps that Leighton puts on the tomb. This one with the pan god, this one with the broken slave shackle, and then this one is for her translations of the Greek Christian fathers with the cross, and to celebrate her knowledge of Greek and Hebrew. And in our cemetery, we have buried a black slave, she's freed, Nadezhda. She was 14 and brought to Florence from Nubia in the expedition. This is very Edward Said Orientalism of Champollion and Rossellini that's painting at the head of the stairs in the Archaeological Museum. But Rossellini's uncle bought Nadezhda's freedom, and she was baptized in the Russian Orthodox family. And this is given the only Russian Orthodox cross in the cemetery, although we have many Russian burials. All of the Russian nobles and serfs were forced to only have Latin crosses, not the Greek Orthodox or the good and the bad thief and so forth. And her story is told in Cyrillic on the tomb. She is named Nadezhda, which in Russian means freedom. Now, I think I've made a mistake with, okay, screen sharing, let's see. And okay, here we go. I don't know if anyone can help me with this. I seem to have clicked on it because I do want to go. Okay, let's see. There we go. Good. And this is the cemetery as it is restored by my Roma, whose ancestors were slaves and who loved doing this work to show off their skills, because they are extremely skilled, working, always repairing the tools, so they work very inexpensively. And we hope to get the book about the cemetery published, because its story, I think, is magnificent. Penn, his father wanted him to be an English gentleman, to grow up, to study at Oxford under Balliol, under Jowett, Benjamin Jowett, who said to Robert, Penn is not the scholar his mother was. And Penn, Elizabeth had always wanted Penn to study modern languages and be a European diplomat. But Robert shipped him off to England immediately, the way also was done with Aurora in the poem Aurora Leigh. And Penn was miserable. He wanted to be an artist. He managed to escape and go to Brittany and study painting and also sculpture under Rodin. He had an illegitimate daughter, Ginevra, whom he sculpted as Pompilia, the heroine who is murdered in The Ring and the Book. And then he insisted on having this plaque placed on Casa Guidi at the other angle to the one about his mother writing the golden ring between Italy and England. And it quotes, I photographed it very badly this morning. There wasn't enough light. It wasn't really quite dawn yet. And I was trying to get it. But I heard last night a little child go singing 'neath Casa Guidi windows by the church. O bella libertà, o bella. And this is placed by the liberation of the Comune in 1916. And it's echoing Robert Browning's Pippa's song, God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. Penn had to reconcile his parents' antagonism, which is mirrored in Elizabeth's Aurora Leigh, in the antagonism between Romney and Aurora. And it's a sad story, but it's also a wonderful story. I also photographed this one and it came out all right. This is the bibliography, and I'm intrigued by the findings that we have. And now I can stop the share and we can all discuss this material. And I know that, welcome everyone. And how do I find the gallery? Okay, right. Welcome everyone. I talked too much. Now it's your turn. Alex, you were going to talk about the suppression of the convents and the... Can you unmute? Everyone unmute.
I'm the person that Julia referred to in her introduction. I invited her to come to Wellesley, and Wellesley being absolutely full of brilliant women who were, of course, desperate to hear about how you shatter silence and that you don't tell truth obliquely. And there was a just huge gathering for Julia, and seconded only by Adrian Rich coming. So I just want to say, because what you talked about today really is, that's often been talked about, that in this golden ring of particularly women and poets who flourished in this parallel time of political so-called liberation, although it was a little more complex than that. One of the things that I am interested in is also something a little bit later, this is not my period, but which is the Anglo-Florentines that you see in Henry James, that you see in The Portrait of a Lady, where you see the complete mere opposite of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. You see the collector collecting this woman and having really one of the most tragic endings of a novel, with her trapped in this, not just marriage, but in what otherwise has been this liberating culture. And the thing is that so much of the Anglo-Florentine, then Julie and I were talking about this yesterday on the Zoom, was people a little bit later buying up so many of the villas outside of Florence and furnishing them with the great art from the ex-convents and monasteries. And in some ways, you could say that they've actually kept a tradition of that, something that needed to be kept. But I just think that what you've done today, Julia, is to give a kind of golden moment in creative life. And I think it's quite a brilliant presentation about Elizabeth Barrett Browning in particular, because I think even though we think we know some things, you have uncovered so many things that we did not know about that marriage.
Right. It was terrifying reading the documents here in the cemetery, because Robert paid the least possible for her burial, less than for a pauper's burial. And he wasn't allowing her access to the funds that she was creating in that marriage. And her distress over the treatment of the slave, Mary Krebsat, is ghastly. And then to realize that she only has access to the ship money, which is a slave ship and a convict ship. She's using her poetry to speak out against the patriarchy, but she's so crippled. And Robert even told her that the Cabinet of Vieux was not allowed, didn't allow women readers. And that's not true. Sarah Parker Raymond is one of the registered readers, Lady Blessington is, and so forth. Women definitely were allowed in the Cabinet of Vieux. It's Robert who wants to keep her away from reading the current newspapers and the political situation. He is censoring her, just the way the Grand Duke was censoring Florence in order to keep control. And I find that really tragic. The cemetery is full of, for instance, Emma Carey is Horatio Nelson's half-sister. She becomes a governess on the continent. Catherine McKinnon is from the very poor island of Mull, and she becomes Tsar of Russia's governess. The 19th century women couldn't go to university, but they could teach themselves and become teachers, and the genre of the governess novel, which is Jane Eyre and so on, is extraordinary, and it's an expression of women's desire to have independence. And this is a time when, for instance, today it's easier not to have a baby and to have an affair. But back then, the risk for the woman was enormous, which you see happening with Margaret Fuller, and you see happening with the character in Aurora Leigh, Marianne, and so on. The tyranny that women lived under was enormous. And so I should be opening this to comments. Nick, do you have something on the pre-Raphaelite side?
Well, actually, the pre-Raphaelites that I've always studied were a later generation than the Barrett Brownings.
That's right.
Yes.
Coleman Hunt's wife is buried, I think, 6 years later, but next to Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and he sculpts her tomb.
And then Evelyn de Morgan and William de Morgan, Spencer Stanhope, who lived in Florence. They were all from a later generation, but Judy Oberhausen and I published an article about something these two generations had in common, and that was spiritualism. Members of these two generations enjoyed talking to the deceased, and this article of ours is entitled Ottocento Spiritualism, and it sort of compares the earlier Victorians and their habits of talking to the deceased with the later Victorians who lived in Florence during the 1890s. That was Evelyn de Morgan and William de Morgan and all their pre-Raphaelite friends like Burne-Jones, William Morris, who all came to the Villa Nuti in Florence to meet with Spencer Stanhope. That's about all I can say about the connection between my Victorians and yours.
Yes, although they do overlap, Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Robert and Elizabeth Browning do overlap. And he's actually drawing Tennyson in their presence, which I love. And what I see a very strong relationship going on between Anglo-Catholicism, which is very much a medievalism movement. It's not modern Catholicism. It's the Catholicism before the Reformation and the celebration of its medieval art, anachronistically in the Victorian period against the industrialization. So you get that, you get the pre-Raphaelites, and you get also the Anglo-Florentines. What's fascinating in this cemetery is that there's a whole group of Swedenborgians who are into spiritualism, and all of their tombs are together. They've arranged to be in one part of the cemetery, and Hiram Powers is part of that. And Took, her father was friends with William Blake, and so on. So you get these marvelous links going on. And if you remember, even as late as Fellini's Dolce Vita, you get the mad English spiritualists going on. They're trooping through the garden with their candles. And there's a lovely cartoon on Facebook at the moment of a group of people holding hands, you know, speaking to the voices. Are you unmute? Can you unmute? Comparing spiritual seance with a Zoom meeting. So I think that's a good point to have brought up. Thelma and Olive, do you want to say something about the Trollops and the Garrows?
Not really. I mean, we recently found some notes we got years ago from an American library, which had some stuff to do with Garrow, which we haven't really thoroughly looked at yet. We'll let you know if there's anything interesting in them. I mean, the interesting thing is, I think there were probably tensions between Fanny Trollope and they shared a house, didn't they? There were various things in the house. I'm not quite sure whether Fanny Trollope wasn't at times a bit difficult to live with as far as they were concerned, but when she was getting older.
By this time, she's very elderly and not quite with it any longer. She's exhausted. She's been having to support her family, the children, because the husband was no good. He was a sales lawyer. And, you know, she was very enterprising in doing the bazaar in Cincinnati and so forth. But I think by the time she was writing and writing and writing travel books and novels and so forth, just to keep the wolf from the door. And I think by the time she retires to Florence, she's had it.
Worn out, I should think.
Yes.
Have you recently been rereading Thomas Trollope's Marietta? Which is interestingly set in Florence, which is rather fun to read.
And sometimes I feel that Tom Trollope's feelings for his wife are reflected in the way the heroine there is described.
Right, yes.
Originally. Yes.
Could you describe that?
A young woman with strong artistic leanings, shall we say, with quite a dominating father.
Yes, right. The Theodosia is fascinating, and both she and Isa, they're similar backgrounds, very much mixed race women, exotic and very very active politically and so forth, and yeah.
And her her journalism, this is Theo, her journalism was quite remarkable, really.
Yeah. I would like to know more about them. Yes.
Yes, in the reports that she sent back to England for publication.
And Joanne Fried is an archaeologist working on Carthage, and she was writing a biography of the Nathan Davis, who was the clergyman who was doing the archaeological dig and trying to get his birth date. And she contacted me because he's buried in the other cemetery when this one was closed in 1877, the Elori. And unfortunately, although it was a perpetual tomb, they hadn't realized that, and they'd considered his son to be the perpetual burial. So his tomb is preserved, but not the father's. So we've got no indication of the birth date of Nathan Davis, but his children were born in Carthage. Is that right?
Yeah. I love the Victorian period, Julia, but you just sort of, this is sort of bruising to find out the, real backstories here.
Yes, right. One of the things that came to me is there were very few fatalities involving horses, although we have so many involving cars. But there were a lot of fatalities and shipwrecks. And that was a very hazardous form of travel, touch and go, Lloyd's insurance and so on and so forth, slave ships and so on. And the journeys these people made using horses and ships were quite extraordinary. Irene Kukota, would you like to add something?
No, to be honest. Sorry. I'm just trying to, you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
No, I was just listening to the story of a remarkable woman, really, because I want to find out more about the English cemetery in Florence and about the people who are buried there. So it's just something new that I've learned today. Thank you.
Right. Right. I'm grateful that you came, Irene, and you were so enthusiastic. You tried to be here at 6 o'clock instead of 8.
Oh, sorry for the confusion.
Yes. And Peter Berman, this is the Guild of St. George, and I would love to hear your perspective on this, John Ruskin.
Well, first of all, I am consumed by a cold. I'm afraid my sniffing has probably been a feature.
It's not contagious to us.
Marvelous. That Zoom doesn't enable us to do that. But what a wonderful talk, Julia. I'm really so pleased you invited me to be present for it. And I was listening hard. My scholarly interest has been in Philip Webb, and I feel constrained to mention his name because he made a long winter journey in Italy, but in the 1880s when he was very poorly. And one of his clients was Spencer Stanhope. So one of the things you've done for me is to raise a whole lot of other possibilities of relationships and interactions and so on. Another person I feel constrained to mention, who I'm sure enters the story somewhere is George Howard, the 9th Earl of Carlisle, so much involved with the Pre-Raphaelites and such a great patron, for example, of Edward Burne-Jones. And since you invoke Ruskin, I mean, it isn't often realized what a close friend Ruskin was of the Burne-Joneses, and they even went on holiday with them in Italy.
Yes.
So one of the things you've very kindly done for me is to raise a lot of interesting speculations and questions, which I will enjoy following up. Anyway, it's been a wonderful talk, and I'm looking forward to being with you in Florence, I hope, in
Yes.
May for your conference.
Yes. April 15th, we're planning when the irises are all in full bloom in the cemetery, and it just becomes a dream thanks to the Roma planting them. We're doing Florence
document about it.
City and Book. Wow.
Yes.
Yes. That's our 10th City and Book in 22 years. And,
oh, really?
Yes.
God.
We began on the alphabet and the Bible. It's the year when European Union was being very Freemasonry and against Christianity. And I was trying to point out that if we took away the alphabet and the Bible, what we have left of European culture? And yet neither of them are European. I felt we needed to learn that humility about it, as you know, from Carthage and Augustine and so forth, Joanne. And then the second one was on the manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts here in Tuscany, half of which were by women, the Dante's Commedia, but also Hildegard von Bingen's manuscript, a beautiful manuscript in Lucca, and also, I'm trying to remember her name, the woman who climbed Mount Sinai and went to Jerusalem, Egeria. Her manuscript is in Arezzo and so forth, and Brigitta's manuscript in Siena and Florence. So these were all, you know, we discussed those along with Dante and Brunetto Latino and so forth. And then we did one on the English cemetery with Gabinetto Viessieux. And then the Americans asked if they could do one on the Americans in the English cemetery. We've got 100 Americans. And that was a splendid conference. That one we had no money for, and we learned that we could do a conference with no money. I think Arjun's a little bit worried because I'm suggesting we continue that way. And we did one on Walter Savage Landor and Arnold Henry Savage Landor, with the Landor descendants present, and the reburial of the Landors who were up in the Portesanti cemetery in our cemetery because they were thrown out. In Italy, they throw out the bodies after a period of time. It's not like our tradition at all. You do sort of have to protect some of them. And we just continued, you know, we did one in Monte Amiata, we did one in Norwich on Julian of Norwich. And we've always published the proceedings on the web. I do it all myself, and it doesn't cost money, and it reaches many more people than a printed book and a dusty library shelf. So I think we managed to. The revolution has seized the printing press, and so. But it's. I find these conferences wonderful because so many interesting people come together, and now we can do it hybrid because to cut down on the expense of travel and lodging and so on. And we have an Indian dinner at the end of it.
Sorry for interrupting,
yes.
Julia.
Yes.
Sorry, I missed it. When did you do the conference in Walter Savage Landor?
It was some years ago. It was quite extraordinary because we were burying an American Landor descendant alongside of other Landor descendants. So we had the living descendants present, and we had an Anglican priest and a Catholic monk side by side doing the blessings, and they forgot to bring the documents for Arnold Henry Savage Landor. So I had to go back up to Portisante, but we had the head of the cemeteries in Florence, so she said, go ahead. And when I went back up to Portisante and retrieved the documents and read them, he had died of
Amazing.
anthrax.
That's cute.
You know, my
Well, what an
job
amazing
is
story.
the risks that I run in this cemetery are quite extraordinary. Trees nearly falling on me, and so on and so forth. It is, but it's an interesting job to have. And we also know of Henry Adams' sister, who dies in the Chaos chapter, The Education of Henry Adams, from a traffic carriage accident. She's the one of two fatalities with horses that I've come across. And she dies of tetanus as a result. And we lost that. We couldn't find that tomb, and the Boston Historical Society wanted it to, you know, to at least put up a plaque. And then one day we found a tomb leaning against the wall, had that inscription. It was hers, and it had been vandalized, and great big pieces were in different places, so we put them all back together. And it's been an interesting job. And also there was a lieutenant colonel back 100 years ago who published a wonderful catalogue of all of the English tombs in the cemetery. And he does it in the physical ordering of the tombs. So some of the tombs we could tell which were lost, and some of the inscriptions which we could no longer read, he had already done. So using this document created 100 years ago in several numbers of notes and queries, we were able to do a lot of the restoration. It's like doing an enormous jigsaw puzzle. And then the documents, the archives are extraordinary because they list all of the expenses, the gloves for the pastor, the black plumes on the horses, whether the coffins are silk lined or the tomb is brick lined or not, and so on. So you get a very strong, and often the servants get first class burials. And one of the burials is of the natural son of King William IV, whom Queen Victoria kept out of the country. He was always in India or in Latin America and so forth, and then retires to Florence. And the three tombs are exactly equal. The servant on the tomb, his tomb is inscribed, more than a servant, a friend, more than a friend, a brother, from the epistle, and his wife. So the woman, the king's son, and the servant are equalized. And I think this is the message of this cemetery. It's slaves and serfs and servants buried side by side with nobles. There's the Countess of Strathmore and King Horn, who grew up in Glamis Castle, the Queen Mother's relative, and so on. So it's nobility and paupers all muddled together in a kind of democracy of death, and so many alphabets, so many nations, so many languages, Russian, Greek, Scandinavian, and Croatian, and Croatian deserter who gets buried as a pauper, and so on. And to find all of the stories, and I think it was Alex who said yesterday, it's like having, you know, the book that we're writing on the stories of all the people. It's like having, what did you say, 1,000 novels?
No, 400 novels. 400
Yes,
novels,
right, I exaggerate.
of which there are, as in any good novel, then there are many, many other backstories and characters.
Right, yes. And they're true. And sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And I love the sadness, though, is Isa Blagden and Robert Lytton. She saves his life in Bagni di Lucca. He's very ill and almost doesn't make it. And he writes Lucille about her, and she writes Agnes Tremaine about him. But they can't marry each other because she's mixed race. And he marries a proper English woman, and their daughters all become suffragettes. And he becomes the first viceroy of India and presides over the most terrible famine. And I really feel that book needs to be written, and it isn't. It's, I keep trying to persuade people to write it. I'm too old to write it myself. I want someone else to do it, and to do it well. I made a mistake suggesting to Margaret Forster that I was saying that there'd be a wonderful novel about Lily Wilson, who goes mad, and her mad scene should be like King Lear. She's the mother who calls her children Orestes, Pylades, and would have called her daughter Electra. And what does Margaret Forster do? She gave her a damp housemaid's soul. It isn't the Lily Wilson I know at all. It's, you know, it's an educated woman looking down on an uneducated woman, and I just don't accept that. So these are the comments, and a prayer that Oxford might take into consideration this book. The index alone is something like 40 pages. But the index is important because everyone is so interconnected. It shows it.
Hi, Julia.
Yes, did you want to make a comment, Sue?
Yes, you were talking about 400 books, or someone commented. The story that you told me about the maid, the Jamaican maid who financed the writing of the
That's right, Mary Trepsack, yes.
A movie. That sounds really up there. That sounds very fascinating. But I thought it was interesting the first time you mentioned anything about the Swedenborgians being buried. I wasn't aware of that. I live in the Philadelphia area, and I had stumbled upon this area. It's called Brenathan, and there is an outshoot of the Swedenborgians, who is actually it's a lovely area. If you drive there, they have so much land. But it was Reverend Pitcairn who had actually had an offshoot of them. There was a divide of some kind. So Pitcairn, it turns out, was the son of the, I guess he was the founder or co-founder of Pittsburgh Plate Glass, which is still a company, and it's a privately owned company, but that financed a lot of the Pitcairn, wealth out here. But when you drive through the area, you feel like you could be in the English countryside. It was so gorgeous, and untouched. And then you're like, oh, I'm just like in Philly, And it's called the Life Lord's New Church. So NC and New and wait L. New C. Yeah, L. I can't talk. Right. But you got LNC. And they had a concert there or something. But I just thought this was very interesting. So I'm kind of more interested in looking into the Swedenborgians.
Yes. That is fascinating because it sort of ties in also with Blake and so forth. And the movements, I mean, we talk about the Free Raphaelite Brotherhood, we talk about the Guild of St. George, but also what I found fascinating, despite the horrors of industrialization, there were the movements of Robert Owen and also my family, Saltaire. Saltaire is actually beautiful. It's this huge Yorkshire wool mill, but the architecture, great-grandfather was borrowing from St. Petersburg, which is Italian architecture, because Catherine the Great was employing all of these Italian architects to do not fake marble columns, but real ones, and so on. And Saltaire is an ideal model town, mill town, with the railroad, the canal, the river, and houses, stone houses for all the workers, and the caring, and which he doubled it from what Sir Titus Salt had built. and Sir James Roberts. And he was walking across the moors from Haworth barefoot to work in the mills at 11 years old, which was illegal because Elizabeth and Fanny and had, you know, with their poetry had changed the English laws, and you couldn't work under the age of 12. He became manager at 18 and then owner of Saltaire, and bought Haworth Parsonage for the nation, the Brontes, because he knew he was taught by Patrick Bronte as a child until he was 11, and taught himself fluent Russian to trade with St. Petersburg and Yorkshire. So there's that side of the industrial world in England, the Robert Owen, the Titus Salts, James Roberts, and the Aykroyds, and so on. Which I think they were influenced also by the Ruskin sermonizing in stone and so on. Peter, would you like to add anything?
Well, since you mentioned the Guild of St. George again, I'm grateful that you have. I don't know if everyone else knows that it still exists, founded in 1871, and its primary motivation is very well expressed in Ruskin's letters to the workmen of England, called Florence Clavigera.
Yes.
And especially the first one's very well worth reading. But the impulse was to make human lives better. So he very much fits in with the others who, from their wealth, perceive the needs of others and try to do something about it. And amongst many things that we could mention, he financed housing for the poor in London, especially.
Working with Octavia Hill, yes.
Yes, with Octavia Hill, absolutely.
And her grandfather, who raised her, is buried here, Sir Thomas Southwood Smith.
Yes.
And he's wonderful. Yes. He's the one who was getting Elizabeth and Fanny to write about the problems of child working mills and factories. And it was I think it was a kind of movement of solidarity for slaves, women, children, all of the other that were not part of the patriarchy, including instead of exploiting.
Very inspiring what you've been saying. I think I'd just like to mention the Guild of St. George has a very good website. So if anyone wants to explore a little further what it does now, I mean, we try to act in a Ruskinian spirit always, whatever we're doing. And at the moment, we're having a series of monthly readings under the heading Ruskin and the Craft, because yet another thing that he did was to encourage the survival of vernacular craftsmanship. Anyway, I'm being summoned to supper, so I hope you'll all forgive me.
Right, okay, we've been talking too long as it is. We always go on for an hour.
I also want to mention I'm speaking from deeply rural Scotland, and I imagine we're a very international group, which is also very enjoyable and very nice to be a part of. So
we're
thank
so
you very
honoured
much.
to have you. Thank you, Peter. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye. And so probably it is time to be winding up. And Laura, did you want to say anything?
I don't really have anything to add, but I had a question for you, Julia. Yeah. Just curious, when did your scholarship around Elizabeth Barrett Browning begin?
That's a wild story. My father, who was very sort of misogynistic, really was convinced that women were inferior and despised Gandhi for his feminine masochism and his espousal of poverty. And I used to, I love my father, but his Oxford background and so forth, he cried when I was born because I was a girl. And his agent then just got him a contract to write a book on Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And my father at that point was ill with Parkinson's and didn't tell his agent that it was going to be difficult for him to write this book. he'd already published 8 books. And I was a graduate student at Berkeley with no money and 3 small children, writing my dissertation on Dante, Langland and Chaucer. And I was having to do the research on Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and I was saying to my father, oh, why did you sign that contract? And then I was realizing how wonderful she was, because I was accepting the image that Robert Cromwell created of her as this sick room invalid and so on, sentimental, because he kept publishing her worst poems after she died. He really undid her reputation. John Ruskin had said she was better than Shakespeare, that he adored Aurora Leigh and was considering that all working girls should read it. And so I was doing the research and just becoming absolutely fascinated by her when I was a medievalist and she's Victorian. So years later, you know, I kept saying I would like to do an edition instead of a sappy biography, because there hadn't been an edition since 1900. And I talked Christopher Ricks into writing the contract with Penguin. And that's why I'm here. That's why I got this job, looking after her too, and raising the money when it was about to crumble, because the marble that Giovinazzi, the Italian sculptor, used was so cheap that the columns were very unstable. And the whole thing could have collapsed if we hadn't restored it in time. So, and I became converted to women through that, and then also worked on Julian of Norwich as a result. So it's a long story. And tonight has been a long story. So thank you, all of you.
Thank you, Julia.
Julia.
Wonderful.
Thanks a
wonderful.
lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And happy
Thank
New Year.
you. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good night. Yes.
Good
Bye.
night.
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 Bye.
Have you turned it off now? Or what?